Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Pharo Foundation's Afri-CAN series. Today, we will be setting the tone for the series by discussing the role of the private sector in catalyzing innovation for economic development, with specific reference to Africa. So, everyone idealizes innovation as this great light bulb moment which changes everything, when that miracle of human ingenuity comes up with a new idea. But actually, there is a long and windy road from that moment to its application and ultimately to its impact on economic development. So, how exactly does the private sector fit into the whole process? With me today, I have Pharo Foundation's new CEO, Thomas Mason, who is a serial entrepreneur from Kenya with lots of experience in the social impact space. Over the last decade, he has led Dube, an integrated pest management company, which became BioLine Agrosciences Africa, serving as managing director and then regional business unit director for Africa, the Middle East, and Oceania. Before that, he was regional manager of Pfizer's agricultural business and later co-founded BioBox, a provider of water waste treatment solutions. He will share his vision of how Pharo Foundation can harness the innovations of its Pharo Ventures social enterprises to deliver African economic development. He is joined by Jean-Pierre Dube, who is the James M. Kilts Distinguished Service Professor at the Chicago Booth Business School. He is also director of the Kilts Center for Marketing and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Jean-Pierre's research studies pricing, advertising, branding, digital marketing, retailing, nutrition, and the dynamics of consumer and firm decision making. Several of his recent research projects are in collaboration with companies in the US and in China. His MBA course on pricing strategies teaches students how to apply marketing models and analytics to develop pricing strategies, which are a critical component of an entrepreneur's toolkit. He's also currently working with the Marketing Accounting Standards Board's initiative on the future of the Chief Marketing Office role. Very exciting. So let's kick this off with a question to both of you. In your eyes, what has been the greatest innovation by an African business in the last 10 years? Maybe shall we start with Tom?
Yeah, I'll always have an opinion on this. I'm not going to say our own at Dudu Tech, although I would love to claim that. I think certainly speaking locally with Nairobi behind me would be the launch of the M-Pesa platform, which was an SSD-based, SIM card-based financial platform that effectively banked most of Kenya, and there are crazy statistics about the amount of our GDP that now flow through the M-Pesa platform, and it has brought huge convenience for Africans, for Kenyans. We can use M-Pesa across multiple different countries, and simply put, if I have money stored on my phone, I can immediately send money to someone else with their phone number, and it's been absolutely transformative. If you can imagine, a decade ago, how someone in a rural area would receive money from someone in an urban center when their vegetables or produce arrived. The banking system wasn't very sophisticated, and money or cash would have to be passed hand by hand, and now it happens within seconds. It's glorious.
Brilliant. How about you, JP?
Well, I didn't want to sound like I'm unoriginal here, but I actually was thinking M-Pesa as well. It's a little bit of an unfair example because, I mean, it was launched in 2007, and you said the last 10 years. So we're kind of cheating, but it's hard to really overlook the fact that it's been transformative. And I just want to point out that besides resolving a lot of the financial exclusion that's been a real problem in sub-Saharan Africa, it also really helped launch a lot of subsequent fintech innovation. And so to the extent we want to look at what are the most innovative fintech firms, it's hard to really talk about them without talking about the backbone, which was M-Pesa. And what made M-Pesa really original for the sub-Saharan African context is it really wasn't affiliated with a bank. So if you think like UPI in India, it was really just a way to create links with existing banks and individuals and their mobile phones. But M-Pesa realized that that wasn't going to be a solution. Most people were totally unbanked, little like underbanked, not even being a word, just unbanked. And so it just created a whole new backbone. Okay, I'll give one example and I won't dwell on it, but since I'm a retailing person, I do a lot of research on retailing and consumer goods. It's hard for me not also to mention Africa's first unicorn, which is Jumia. This has just been less of what I would call an innovation. It's not transformative the way M-Pesa was, because M-Pesa was a whole new concept that had never existed in the West. In fact, if anything, leapfrogged the West. Jumia is really about proof of concept that Western-style digital retailing can and does succeed, not just in Nigeria where it was launched, but in, I think it must be in over a dozen countries now in Africa. And it just shows you that there's a real hunger for Western-style retailing.
Very interesting. Okay. So another question to both of you, moving into something a bit more sort of theoretical. How do you think private companies and entrepreneurs drive innovation? And what is the role of the profit motive within this process? Maybe let's start with JP this time.
Sure. I mean, the simple answer is that when you have a profit as the reward in the end, first and foremost, it just attracts efficiency and scalability. I mean, that's where the payoffs are, right? Is minimizing costs and building scalable solutions is the entrepreneurial mission. That's like the goal. That's how you reap reward. But I think the example we've seen all over the world is it's also a great way to attract talent and skilled professionals. So if you think in China, for example, the tech revolution they saw in places like Shenzhen, Hangzhou, for example, has just created a huge base of human capital, which is the word we like to use in economics. Just think of it as a concentration of highly skilled technical labor. There's obviously the disciplinary aspects. The usual trade-off between risk and payoff is a disciplinary force to avoid waste and squandering resources. And of course, there's the fact that it tends to avoid some of the corrupt practices that we get when we rely on governments to supply infrastructure and other sorts of things. I just want to point out one shortcoming, though, or two maybe. The first one is entrepreneurs, and especially their investors, tend to have very short-sighted visions. And so if we're going to seg into a discussion shortly on long-term solutions in Africa, the downside of entrepreneurs is they want to hit and run. This is like a 5-year window. And once they're gone, there's a question of, well, who's running the organization? Do we have local talent who can keep the mission going? And then, of course, because of the lack of local competition, there's a real risk of monopolies, that somebody comes in, is immensely successful. Who is M-Pesa's main competitor, for example? I'm not pointing at any particular bad act, but it is healthy in Europe and in the United States and China to have competition even for the basic backbone.
Yeah, I'm very interested to hear Tom respond to this.
Yeah, I think look, it's a good segue about what we'll talk later, which is risk capital. I think that, and it's very much what we're trying to do at Pharo Foundation, which is capturing value in Africa. I think that the more investment that we can put into harnessing value on the continent, the more we will unlock the entire financial ecosystem of Africa. We're going to have a visitor on our podcast series in a couple of series time that I was speaking to recently, and this is very much at his heart, which is having this patient risk capital with lower, longer term returns, and I think that's what's important.
Super, thank you. So building also on this discussion, again, if I go back to you, JP, what do you think is the role of the private sector's culture of risk-taking and experimentation in driving innovation? And is this a good fit with the African context?
I mean, I'm going to start with the second part, which is just an unambiguous yes. I mean, Africa has just ripe with untapped opportunity. And if anything, I would say I'm surprised there isn't more momentum for Western entrepreneurs to move to Africa. And it's certainly no surprise to me that when you look at a lot of the big success stories, even a lot of homegrown African startups are often funded or even started by foreigners. So there's just a lot of opportunity. But I also think there's a cultural aspect to entrepreneurship that makes it hard for the models we've seen in the West to be successful in other parts of the world. And that's because capitalism is Darwinistic. And it's hard for people to accept the Darwinism that is intrinsic and necessary for capitalism to function. And that's certainly the case of entrepreneurship. Joseph Schumpeter widely regarded entrepreneurship as the engine of growth in Western economies. And I tend to share that opinion as well. So let's think about what that means. In order for capitalism to exist, you need liquidity. That's finance. And you also need property rights. That's the law. And why is that? Because we need the access to capital to start ventures, and we need the property rights to guarantee that once those ventures succeed, that you get to own the rewards, right? That somebody can't take them from you, right? That's really important. And then how does the risk-taking part fit into all this? Well, in a market where you have liquidity and you have some assurances of property rights, entrepreneurs will take risks, right? And that's the key. But now the downside, the Darwinism, it's only because of the threat of having to own your own failures that entrepreneurial risk-taking is disciplined. And, as soon as governments intervene or the public sector intervenes to try and bail out failures because of the fear of seeing people lose their jobs and seeing all the consequences, that's when it all collapses. Because there has to be a threat to the entrepreneur that bad decisions they're going to bear the brunt of those. It's their capital. It's gone. Same with investors. And I think that's a cultural shift that a lot of people misunderstand. And it's also a part of the reason why it's hard to see entrepreneurial momentum take off in the rest of the world, because we're afraid to accept failure. I don't mean personally, except we're afraid to let people fail. We're afraid to let employees lose their jobs. And then the whole thing falls apart like a house of cards.
Excellent. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Okay, so if we continue sort of in this thought process of theorizing innovation and the path to its applications now, I'd like to call on Tom and ask you about more concrete examples and given your experience, I'd like to know how Dube Tech or any of your businesses were able to catalyze African innovation, and also going forward, what forms of innovation would you like the foundation to stand for, and are social enterprises going to be the main vehicle for it?
Well, I'm on the backdrop of Jean-Pierre's comments. It makes me feel very brave being an entrepreneur in Africa, right? As I think every entrepreneur would probably shout from the rooftops in Nairobi or any African city. It's a tough environment, and there isn't generally a strong legal framework to support your innovation. And it's a tough environment in that sense. We did a couple during my time with some incredible team members. The first at BioBox was really looking at the growth of African cities and recognizing that the utilities that had been designed probably during the colonial era were not serving these massively rapidly growing African cities. And so we effectively looked to privatize wastewater treatment as the cities expanded outside of those traditional confines, and it was a great business. And yes, we had IP behind it, and yes, we had lots of competitors that followed us shortly thereafter. The second at Dube Tech was really, I guess, one of the stories that I just find super exciting. Here the business that was started was a horticultural business producing French beans for export to the European Union outside of season. And the business started with 2 boxes of beans on a British Airways flight to Nairobi. And And then it doubled and it doubled and it doubled. And very quickly, the entrepreneur behind that, a guy called Dickie Evans, recognized that consumers in Europe were going to be very concerned about the sort of pesticides that were being used on export fresh produce. At this point, the business was quite large. A few thousand employees in Kenya, and hundreds of hectares of covered greenhouses producing roses, and thousands of hectares of fields producing all of the different vegetables that you would see in a stir-fry pack if you went into Tesco's or M&S or Jumbo or Lidl in Europe. And the key role that Dudutech was to play was to find an alternative to those synthetic pesticides. And so he recruited a series of scientists who came out to test completely novel technologies, really inspired by Cuba and where they hadn't had access to pesticides and had been able to successfully produce crops. What did it unlock? It unlocked certainly for Africa access to the European Union of being able to produce very safe fresh produce, because we were producing millions of insects, funguses, viruses, and funguses to act as alternatives to traditional synthetic chemical pesticides. And to put it in the scale of where it got to, from a roses and veg perspective, we were talking about multiple 787s every single night, especially during Valentine's season. And from a Dudutech perspective, we were exporting our integrated pest management technologies not only across Africa, but to Europe and the US. And I think it's a great story of African homegrown technology, and fundamentally sort of proprietary strains of those insects being able to play a sort of catalytic solution globally.
Your examples are so far have been largely in big cities where I think my question may not be as relevant, but one thing I've always wondered as being a challenge for entrepreneurship in Africa is fragmentation. And even within a smaller, geographically speaking country, you can see a lot of diversity in languages and cultures. And when you combine that with lack of infrastructure and lack of access, I just wonder if it's just really hard to build or different to build a scalable solution when just communicating with the target population of interest may require many different translations and many different versions. And so I'm just wondering what your experience has been in that dimension.
My favorite story of marketing to a broad-based community was when I was on a flight back from Ethiopia, and I was sitting next to a priest, and I asked him what he did, and he said, he worked for our Lord God. And I said, what is your role? And he said, I'm in marketing. And I said, how are you marketing to the masses? And he had devised a way to transmit small chapters of the Bible via Bluetooth transmission. And this was having a massive scaling effect for him to be able to spread the word of God. Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, it's the biggest challenge. What advantages do we have? Smartphone usage. It's absolutely critical. It's a source of pride for people to be able to have a smartphone. Connectivity is absolutely fantastic. I'm always deeply disappointed when I go to the UK and I lose signal, whereas I can be in the most remote area of Kenya and I'll typically have, a 4G connection, right?
And yet, if I'm not mistaken, the mobile penetration rate is much lower in spite of all this network. I don't think nearly as many people. It's a little bit like India and their initiative, their Reliance Geo initiative to get cheap smartphones out for the masses. And I don't know if that's really happened at the same scale yet in Africa.
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, it would be interesting to get some statistics on it. Look, I think it unlocks an opportunity to be able to communicate to people. But the reality is that the further that you go down in that triangle to the broad-based consumer at the bottom, the more difficult it is and the more challenging. And unfortunately, or fortunately, that's where the biggest opportunity is.
Yep, agreed.
Thank you so much. So moving on to something you were already mentioning, Tom, I think, one of the things that is interesting for me in all this is the role of equity investment. And based again on your own experience, how does equity investment relate to the innovation rate, to development and growth? And again, going back to that critical question, is equity investment more likely to facilitate this scaling up of innovation?
I mean, our resident professor has already answered that question, which is availability of liquidity in the market is the most important thing. I think there's a sort of missing sweet spot, which is this sort of patient risk capital to unlock SMEs that can burgeon and grow to the point that they become attractive to industries like private equity that can then further invest in them before they get listed. And I think we're sort of missing parts of that entire sort of financial ecosystem. I hope that we at Pharo are going, and especially within Pharo Ventures, are going to be able to play a role in that, acting as catalytic investment on the continent. I look at a typical case study, which is our investment into our edible oil factory in Ethiopia. Typically, people have shied away from investments into Ethiopia because of the lack of foreign exchange. There's a certain amount of political risk and instability there as well. And we've just made a significant investment there that, as I mentioned earlier, is going to capture value. We're going to be able to process those sesame seeds into either a semi-finished or a finished product. And I'm super excited about it. But yeah, we're an icebreaker and we really are providing that catalytic funding. And I couldn't be more excited to show that to the world when we've done it.
Yes.
How much would you attribute to high interest rates? I mean, I think like the private equity markets in the US really were thriving in the last 25 years because of our low interest rates and investors looking for other opportunities to make a return on their money. Not to mention, even for entrepreneurs, it was cheap to borrow money. And this is something that was also really critical factor. I was just curious what you think about interest rate policy and interest rates.
Yeah, one of our FP&A team, our financial planning analysis team, gave me a little case study recently, and I think the risk-adjusted rate of return was 26.3%. I mean, it's pretty tough making money at that rate, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's like an entire podcast in itself, and how we counter for that. It's the biggest limiting factor.
Yeah.
Okay. I think you've already sort of answered the question that was left over from when you were talking about Dudu Tech and innovation there, which was the follow-up on, how you would like to sort of see what forms of innovation you would like to see at the foundation. And I think you sort of covered that a bit in your last question answer on patient capital. Is there anything you'd like to add on that front, Tom?
No, I mean we're ironing out our strategy at the moment for Pharo Ventures, but really we see it end to end. We have an appetite to back small scale entrepreneurs, and where possible to also back incubators, which are playing a pretty critical role. I think from the conversations I've had in the last few weeks, there seem to be multiple platforms being created within the next sort of 12-month horizon that are sourcing capital from the grant-giving philanthropic community to be able to create these sort of early stage funds to prove out this concept that this risk capital can unlock all of this money that is sitting within Africa and within the international markets, and that's exactly what we need to do. And I'm just fascinated to see how far we can get. I think one of the most interesting conversations, a lot of people have been very excited about fintech, and there are some very nice fintech businesses in Nairobi, but and there's an entire conversation to be had about venture capital and unicorns and this need to scale very quickly, but I'll leave that for another podcast. Yeah, let's see what happens. I mean, Africa is just the most exciting place to be at the moment. I've been in Nairobi, I've been in Addis Ababa, I've been in Kigali, I've been in Hargeisa in the last month, and it's bubbling, and it's just a really exciting place to be. And there are loads of people coming back to the continent. There's loads of talent available, and there are loads of challenges to be solved.
Great. That could be a final comment, but actually, I do have another question to wrap things up. Going back to something that JP started with, obviously, question to both of you. So in Africa, would you say that the private sector has a more catalytic role to play in economic development than government due to its greater innovative capability?
Well, the simple answer is it can. And before I take too strong a stance in this, I just want to say my biggest concern is that we can see by revealed preference that governments aren't providing the necessary infrastructures and backbones. And without access, this is a word that's popped up throughout our entire conversation, without access, right? All of the opportunities for retailing and purchasing and end consumer, which Tom was referring to either, is the biggest opportunity. I totally agree. They can't be facilitated. And we've used examples like M-Pesa, and I mentioned briefly UPI in India about providing access to liquidity, for example, providing access to finance, right? In Malawi, when farmers got access to direct deposit accounts that were digitized, their crop values went up 20%. And the reason was because it opened up the markets for them where they could sell their crops. But the challenge is we keep using the word access, which means platform, and platforms are inherently tippy, which means they tend to be winner takes all. And the upside is that in the tech sector in the West, people have built lots of platforms. That's been a lot of the biggest success stories in tech in the West were platforms. But at the same time, they're also the regulator's biggest nightmare because platforms tend to have network effects. They scale, but they tend to be winner takes all. And a real worry is that a foreign entity, a foreign business takes over the access. And we just want to make sure that there's some kind of protections in place. With all of that said, without that access, I don't see how the entrepreneur sector and stuff for the end user consumer that will change our everyday lives will ever be able to materialize. So I see a tension there.
Very interesting. Tom?
Yeah, I mean, I've grown up in Africa. I grew up in a small coastal village in Kenya, and then we moved to an island north of Zanzibar in Tanzania that were very, very remote and very rural. And I would access in its most basic form a good road, electricity, cell phone coverage, hospitals, schools. These are all critical elements. And I think Africa's developed at an incredible pace since I was a child, and I've seen firsthand in the communities that I've grown up the difference that can have. I got electricity when I was 13 years old.
Wow.
It was always strange coming to boarding school and people talking about TV programs that I just didn't know what they were talking about. So it shows you the sort of different quantum that we talk about from fintech to the most basic.
Well, thank you so much to both of you, JP and Tom, and it's been a very enlightening discussion. It's really got us thinking about the nature of innovation and the private sector's role in that. In our next Afri-CAN episode, we will look at concrete innovations in the African education space with our guests Panos Hatziandreas from Ethiopia's Lebawi Academy and Anne McKenna from Oxford University. Looking forward to another great one. Bye.